Chapter 25 of John Remington, Martyr, by Pansy and Mrs. C. M. Livingston. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by MaryAnn. Chapter 25. At Last. The front door was closed and locked, but Mr. Mason had already borrowed the latchkey of the chambermaid from the Belvedere who had charge of the rooms, and had been upstairs, only to learn, as he had stated to Elsie, that the door of Dr. Fletcher's room was locked and the key removed. With swift, silent movements the three made their way up the long winding flight of stairs, and Earl Mason sought with nervous haste for the key on the clock which stood in the hole. Certainly here was a key. He could not be sure that the sensation with which he grasped it was one of relief. It fitted itself promptly to the lock, and he threw the door wide open. Will they ever forget the sight which greeted their eyes? A large, handsome room, furnished with exquisite taste and care, showing everywhere the touch of a refined and cultured hand, but in the center of the room, spread upon the table, was an awful shape, shrouded in white, and almost literally buried in flowers. A pillow at the head made of immortelles bore the word Rest, formed of English violets, and placed at proper distances were cross, and crown, and harp, and all the various devices in flowers that modern custom has decreed shall be prepared for the honor of the dead. The air was breathless with the odor of tuberoses, hyacinths, heliotropes, and all rich and delicate perfumes which choice hothouse flowers could bestow. "He is dead," said Fern. "I knew he was." These were the first words she had spoken since they started, and her voice was unnaturally calm. It was evident that her bewildered brain did not take in the strangeness, not to say the insulting, features of the situation. If Dr. Fletcher were indeed dead, what right had other minds than theirs to order his surroundings? The thought flashed instantly upon Elsie, but to judge from Earl Mason's face there were darker ones in his mind. He strode forward and tore, rather than removed, the white covering, tumbling crown and harp upon the floor and trampling upon one of them in his frantic haste. There before them was Dr. Fletcher's face, his eyes closed, the features set. He was in evening dress, just as they had left him the night before. Fern Redpath had moved forward and stood looking down at him, still with that utterly unnatural calm upon her face, but Earl Mason, without so much as glancing at her, tore away the strictures from about the throat of the apparently dead, in wild haste, issuing his orders at the same moment in sharp, quick tones. "This is a case for the doctors. He is not dead. Miss Redpath, take the carriage and drive for Dr. Wadsworth and Dr. Thurston. Wadsworth is the nearest. Do you know where to find him? Bring him first, then go for Dr. Thurston with all possible speed. Elsie, run to the Belvedere and tell them to send me 2 men and a pail of hot water, and fly, both of you. We will save him yet." The effect upon Miss Redpath was different from what he had expected. She had started at his first words like one roused from a trance, and the color rolled in waves over the face which had a moment before been pallid. She clutched at Earl Mason's sleeve and spoke in a terrible whisper. "Mr. Mason, you say he is not dead. Is it alcohol?" "No," said Earl Mason. "It is poison. Be quick, I tell you." But he had no need to say the words. She had turned on the instant and was gone, her white bridal robes trailing utterly unheeded down the stairs. That strange day reached its close at last. Certainly it had been an eventful one to those connected with the tragedy which had been lived through since its dawning. The physicians summoned in wild haste by Fern Redpath, and 2 others whom they had promptly called to their aid, had worked for hours as those who were battling with death. Mr. Mason, Mr. Remington, and others who joined them, had rushed hither and thither obeying the orders given them, while Fern and her mother with Mrs. Remington and Elsie stayed in the elegant parlors below and did that other harder thing, waited. Fern Redpath moved with quick steps up and down the room, or went out into the hall and gazed up the stairs at the closed door above, like one who was holding herself in check by almost superhuman powers. She had not yet reached the stage where she could endure the sound of human voices in inquiry or in sympathy. She even looked imploringly toward Mrs. Remington to answer for her when her mother spoke. At last Earl Mason came to them, the tense lines about his face were relaxed, and a faint smile hovered around his lips. "I bring good news," he said, looking at Fern. "They have conquered. He is rallying steadily. The doctors believe that the danger is past." And then Fern Redpath turned and moved, or tottered, rather, toward a seat, and would have fallen had she not been caught in Elsie's watchful arms. "Poor darling," said the mother, bending over her. "She never fainted before in her life. In all the terrible experiences through which she has been, she never gave way before. I am afraid it will kill her." "Oh, no," said Mrs. Remington soothingly. "It will rest her. I am glad she has fainted. She was too self-controlled to endure it longer." Toward 10 o'clock of the same day, they were lingering, these friends who had lived through so much together, in Dr. Fletcher's upstairs library. Weak as he was, he had quietly insisted upon being dressed, and was sitting back in the large rocker, being entertained, he said with a smile. Very little knowledge had they as yet of the facts connected with the strange experiences of the day. Truth to tell, Dr. Fletcher knew almost as little as any of them. He had found some one waiting for him, he explained, on reaching his rooms the night before. The son of a poor woman whom he had befriended. The boy was in distress. His mother was very sick, and the doctor in attendance did not seem to them to know what he was about. If Dr. Fletcher would only come and see her, he felt that she would be cured. So Dr. Fletcher went, of course, and found that there was need for his services, and stayed long, quite into the night. Then coming home felt exhausted, faint, and remembered that he had been in too much haste that evening to take his usual dinner. He resolved to step into a coffee-house near at hand and take a cup of coffee and some rolls. The coffee-house was one of the more common sort, he explained, but he was interested in the young fellow who was trying to keep it, and often stopped there for a cup of coffee or a glass of milk in order to encourage the man. He noticed that there was some delay in serving him that night, and it led him to ask after a while if he was too late for coffee. But they assured him that it would be ready very soon, so he waited not to hurt the feelings of the proprietor. He noticed that he was served by a new waiter, one who seemed unused to the business, and was awkward, and the proprietor apologized and said their regular help for that hour was out, and they had to take what they could get. When the coffee was finally brought, he discovered that it was not even so good as usual, and it was never remarkable for goodness, but this had a peculiar and disagreeable taste. However, he drained the cup, for the same reason that had brought him to the house. The proprietor was watching him, and had no doubt done the best he could. Then he had gone out, feeling strangely, feeling after a few minutes as if the night was growing chill, and he was getting numb. He had tried to walk rapidly to overcome the sense of lethargy, and had wondered at his being so extremely tired. He began to realize that he could not move rapidly, that his strength was leaving him. Then he became aware that some person or persons met him, stopped and spoke to him, took hold of him. After that he knew absolutely nothing more, saw nothing, felt nothing, until roused by a stinging sensation, and he saw Earl Mason bending over him. The solemnly awful condition in which he had at first been found, Dr. Fletcher did not yet know. Flowers and ghastly drapery had been hurriedly pushed out of sight long before he recovered consciousness. Many and various were the theories advanced concerning this strange and, in some respects, horrible experience. In fact, the house had been alive with speculation all the afternoon. The doctors in attendance had kept their own counsel, only admitting, in response to Mason's eager inquiries, that there had been an improper use of an opiate, probably administered by some person who was ignorant of the true nature of the article he used, and of the seriousness of its effect on a constitution like Dr. Fletcher's. "It is another specimen of those vile attempts at practical joking, I presume," Dr. Thurston said, as he drew on his gloves and prepared to depart. "There is a good deal of that going on, and it touches high circles, I am told. The miscreants who planned this probably did not understand what they were about. They did not mean murder, I suspect. They only meant a lethargy, which would delay his marriage and cause consternation and misery to a number of persons. That is some people's idea of a practical joke. But this was a very narrow escape. I congratulate you, Mason, on not being 5 minutes later." "Who could have planned such a thing?" questioned Mr. Remington. "This coffee-house, for instance. The proprietor knows Dr. Fletcher, has been befriended by him. I know the young fellow. If I can believe in anybody any more, I cannot think that he would be guilty of underhand dealing." "Probably he was not," answered Dr. Thurston. "More than likely the doctor was watched, his footsteps dogged all the evening with a view to practicing upon him. Possibly they had planned to carry out their designs at his club that evening, or wherever he dines, and as he says he did not dine at all, and so failed them there, they traced him elsewhere, and delayed the coffee, as you heard him say, and made friends with the new waiter, who was awkward in the business, or smuggled one of their number in as waiter pro tem. There are a great many ways of managing these matters, Mr. Remington. Clergymen cannot be expected to be posted. Dr. Fletcher has been unfortunate enough to secure the ill will of some of the hard characters in our city. It will not do for either clergymen or physicians to be too pronounced in their ideas. But I congratulate you all on the happy termination of what was very nearly a tragedy, and will bid you good evening. And this was as far as their efforts at investigation had led them as yet. But they lingered and talked in Dr. Fletcher's library. During the afternoon Elsie had been home, and had returned attired in plain street dress. Also she had been at the Redpath home, and had brought to Fern a dress more suitable to the day, as it had developed, than her bridal robes. Mrs. Remington, to whom Mrs. Redpath had clung all day, as one on whom she could lean, had not been home at all, but Mr. Remington, who had been back and forth during the day, had now come to take her away. "It is time we all went away," said Mr. Remington, "and left this man to rest. What are the arrangements for the night, Mason? Who is to stay?" "I can," said Earl Mason, "if that will be agreeable." Then Dr. Fletcher, who had been having a low-toned conversation with Fern, as she stood beside his chair, turned toward the group of planners and electrified them. "Good friends, before you go I have a great favor to ask. We were, as you are aware, to have been married at 10 o'clock. It is now nearly 10, and we are together, and I do not feel as though we could be separated again. What I ask is that you will all remain with us a few minutes longer, and that Mr. Remington will make us husband and wife." "Why, my dear Fern," exclaimed Mrs. Redpath, "surely you will not, you cannot, dear, be married under such strange circumstances, and in that dress." "Yes, I can, mother." Fern's voice was clear and calm. "I feel with Dr. Fletcher that it is not possible for us to be separated again. I am not going to leave this house tonight, and I should be glad to have the right to stay beside him." "Amen," said Earl Mason, in so grave a tone that no other word would have seemed to fit. "But, my dear child," urged Mrs. Redpath, "what will people say? And the guests, and then the elegant wedding breakfast." It was not possible to smile at this, but Dr. Fletcher laid one hand on his future mother's arm. "My dear mother," he said persuasively, "think what we have been through. Will not the guests forego the pleasure of the marriage ceremony in view of what we have suffered? As for the elegant wedding breakfast, can we not have it, say, day after tomorrow, and bid them all to enjoy it with us? Then we will quietly carry out the other part of the program, and take the 12 o'clock train. I shall be quite ready for a wedding breakfast and journey by that time. But as for separating us in the meantime, we have already borne enough." "Yes," said Mr. Remington heartily, "I respect your judgment in the matter. Miss Redpath's nerves have certainly borne enough. Besides, there is a sort of poetic justice in being married after all, despite all your enemies have done to prevent it, on the very day and hour which you appointed." Mrs. Remington, who felt that this conversation had run in grave channels as long as was wise for the nerves of some of them, here interposed. "Really, dear Mrs. Redpath, you may as well yield. Mr. Remington is evidently resolved upon performing the ceremony himself. I think it gives him great pleasure to take Dr. Oliver's place. But do let me put this bride into white again. The bridal robes are here, and it will not take the bridesmaid and myself 10 minutes to arrange them." So it came to pass that just as the little cathedral clock, from its niche in the hall, told in silver tones that it was once more 10 o'clock, the bride, white-robed and beautiful, stood beside her pallid bridegroom, and the marriage vows were taken. Surely there was a peculiar solemnity in the minister's tones, and a peculiar fitness in the words, "I pronounce you husband and wife, and what God hath joined together, let not man put asunder." Not long thereafter, the groomsman took his bridesmaid home in a carriage. Of course, as they rolled through the quiet streets, the startling, constantly varying events of the day were almost of necessity the topic of conversation. "I do not understand it in detail," said Earl Mason, "but there are circumstances connected with it which lead me to believe that it is an exceedingly complicated piece of business. The illiterate note, the obscure coffee-house, and the vile cup of coffee are all in keeping with the low-down class of conspirators. but the exquisite villainy exhibited in the management of the whole after scene leads me to suspect that another class of mind was the instigator of the whole. Those flowers, Miss Chilton, were exquisite, and all the appointments costly and beautiful from the standpoint of the society world. It looks to me as though some villain in high life had planned, and by means of money or threats, or in some other way, had secured the cooperation of the lower class. It was the very refinement of villainy, if I may use the term, which planned all that elegant array of horror, and left the victim alone to die. I know, said Elsie, catching her breath. I feel what you mean. It does not seem to me that I can ever again endure the scent of tuberoses, or mignonette, or even the sight of English violets. Wasn't it too awful to place that pillow of flowers at his head? Mr. Mason, do you know, I believe that Alec Palmer had to do in some way with this whole matter. And then Earl Mason experienced such a shock through all his frame as none of the previous occurrences of the day had been able to produce. In his astonishment he was guilty of repeating her words. Alec Palmer had to do with it? Is it possible that you have any reason for such a statement? No, said Elsie, already ashamed, and realizing for the 100th time the immense difference between the two men. One could originate a slander against a character which had been above reproach through all the years of its history. The other was shocked at the bare suggestion of such evil, even though he could have no respect for the character of the man whose name she had mentioned. I ought not to have said that, Elsie made haste to add. I thought aloud. But your suggestion that the whole scheme was planned by someone in high life brought it forcibly to mind. Mr. Mason, Alec Palmer hates this whole subject of gospel temperance with an extreme hatred. He hated Fern, and Dr. Fletcher especially, I think, since the evening of the temperance rally. I saw him at the reception that evening, with such a strange, fierce scowl upon his face when he looked at them, as might have preceded almost any evil planning. And he can speak so terribly ill of others, without any provocation, can consider others capable of such awful things, that I feel sometimes as though it might almost justify me in thinking that he himself is capable of them. I believe him to be a bad man, and I have reason to think that he would stoop to any form of revenge against those whom he dislikes, provided there was a fair possibility of his not being discovered. Mr. Mason was so silent under this avalanche of astounding words as to fairly force from Elsie her next hurried sentences. I know, Mr. Mason, you think me cruel, unchristian in my conclusions. I know I ought not to have spoken as I did, without proof. But that man has become such an offence to me, I despise his character so utterly, that I could hardly help, under the excitement of the moment, saying what I did. I could as soon accuse an angel of being cruel or uncharitable, he said at last, and there was a strange new tone in his voice, almost of exultation. I am simply bewildered, Miss Chilton, overwhelmed. I have been deceived. I had supposed, that is, I had been led to think of Mr. Palmer as your nearest and dearest friend, and I thought that any other than respectful words about him was an insult to you. Elsie made a little movement almost of impatience, and spoke quickly. Is it not almost an insult to me, Mr. Mason, that you conceive of a man like the one you seated on my father's doorstep, while you summoned a policeman to help him home, as being my nearest and dearest friend? Ah, but I believed you thought him simply the victim of the sins of others, he said eagerly, even as Dr. Fletcher was to-day. That is what I thought you had been taught to believe. The circumstances are entirely different, I know. They did not drug Dr. Fletcher with alcoholic poison. They were wise enough to know they could not do that. But I did not know you understood the difference fully, and indeed, Miss Chilton, I thought I had good authority for my belief. I tell you frankly, I overheard the gentleman himself say that it was an engagement. That it is not so, that I heard from your lips that all this is false, gives me such a feeling to-night as I cannot describe, gives me such a hope as I thought never to have. Elsie, I have been utterly deceived myself. Have I deceived others? Is it news to you that there has for years been but one woman in the world to me? But these two, who have blundered so long and so well, who have had innumerable opportunities for enlightening each other, and have but succeeded in plunging themselves into deeper bewilderment, may surely now, toward the midnight of a day so full of excitement and care and pain as this has been, be permitted to have a little quiet conversation to themselves, without any intruding eye to watch, or any inquisitive ear to listen. End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of John Remington, Martyr, by Pansy and Mrs. C.M. Livingston. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by MaryAnn. Chapter 26. Selfishness and Self-Abnegation. It was several days afterwards that Mrs. Remington told as much as she knew of the story to her husband, and confided to him the hope that these two would have peaceable times now. They have had such a bewildering and stormy acquaintance heretofore. It does seem to me, she had said, with a long-drawn sigh, that it is time for us all to have a little peace. We have been through seas of trouble and anxiety, and almost everything that can happen has. If we could only find out the details of that horrible scheme about Dr. Fletcher, and discover what sent Alec Palmer to Europe at 24 hours' notice, I think I should be willing to settle down for a while and let the outside world alone. We cannot let the outside world alone, he had replied gravely. We must be about our Master's business. There's a great deal of work to be done, and the night cometh when no man can work. I think I must prepare a sermon on that text. It has been with me all day. I have said it over repeatedly in my study. The night cometh when no man can work. You're working too hard, his wife had said, giving him a swift, anxious glance, but he laughed cheerfully. I? No, I'm in my prime. I never felt stronger, or better able to work. I am glad to be a young man yet, and to realize that I have probably long years before me in which I can serve him. But even to the longest life, Mattie, the night cometh. The summer sped away. Mr. Remington and his family went, for the month of August, to the old farm at Maplewood. There they took long walks and drives, and lived over again those earlier days of their life together, and felt that they were a great deal older and wiser, were indeed getting to be middle-aged people who had had experience. Mrs. Remington confided to her husband that in those early days she had rather longed for the time to come when she might consider herself matronly, and of course wise. Little John rolled and tumbled in the hay, frisked with the lambs, fed the chickens, and managed Aunt Hepsy with the skill of a general, and with twice the success that he had had, even with Aunt Hannah. One beautiful Sunday they all drove over to Stony Ridge and spent the Sabbath, and Mr. Remington preached in the old church, which he had helped to make new, and compared notes with Brother Porter, and cheered that young man's heart with words of commendation and encouragement. And little John spent one entire morning with Mrs. Blake, and his mother was shown the tub which His Majesty had insisted on using for a bath on that memorable morning, and the clothes the sallow-faced baby had worn on the night of his arrival. And Mrs. Blake confided to sympathetic ears the pangs of wounded feeling she had suffered over the little shirt, and the two women had laughed and cried and kissed little John, and prayed together about it all, and knew that their two hearts were knit together in a bond of affection which death could not sever. August vanished all too soon. They came back early in September to the heat and the cares and the joys of the city. Mr. Remington took hold of his work with renewed vigor. He declared that he had a new lease of life, and Dr. Fletcher told him in a significant tone that he worked as though he had several leases of life. Once more Elsie Chilton renewed her frequent visits to the Remington home. Not quite so frequent as they used to be, because she now had to go often to Dr. Fletcher's to keep Mrs. Professor company while her husband attended to his duties in the college. Apparently, as Mrs. Remington had wished, life had settled, for all of them, into quiet lanes at last. At least, outwardly. Certainly nothing could be brighter, or calmer in the truest sense of that word, than Dr. and Mrs. Fletcher's life together. As for Elsie Chilton, what Mrs. Remington considered the disturbing element in her life had departed suddenly for Europe. Elsie knew what had hurried him away. Her father suspected it, but she kept her own counsel. It was after the temperance rally which had been described, and before the day appointed for Fern Redpath's marriage, that she received a communication from Mr. Palmer, dignified and somewhat haughty. In it he informed her that he confessed to some astonishment over the treatment he was receiving at her hands, having looked upon her as the very embodiment of refined Christianity. He had explained to her in detail the manner in which he had fallen victim to a conspiracy against him. He had hinted that he knew who the chief conspirator was, and had only refrained from mentioning his name out of motives of courtesy to her, since she had been so unfortunate as to number him among her acquaintances. He had failed to hint what he strongly suspected, that jealousy was the ruling motive prompting the villainous act, because he himself had the honor to be known as her friend. It seemed strange indeed to him that, having made all possible explanations, and borne much in silence in order to shield her from unpleasant notoriety, he should be treated so coldly. So, if the lady in question were anybody but Miss Chilton, he would have to say, discourteously, would she kindly inform him what further concession she demanded at his hands, in what way he could show that he was willing to serve not only her, but her father, to the extent of his poor ability. If he had not been plain-spoken enough in the past, if she would afford him opportunity, he should only be too glad to express himself with utmost plainness. He had supposed that there was an implied understanding between them, that of course the old friendship was as strong as ever. If he had been misunderstood, or if there was anything which he could do to make his position, and his intentions, perfectly plain to Miss Chilton, he was prepared to do it. But he felt that he had the right of a gentleman to demand that he should be treated with ordinary courtesy. So long as she chose to frown upon every attempt on his part to see and converse with her, what could he be expected to do? This long, rambling, and in some respects contradictory letter was read hurriedly by Elsie, and responded to promptly with unmistakable plainness. Miss Chilton declines to hold any further communication with Mr. Palmer, either by letter or conversation, upon this subject or any other, from this time forth. Within a very few days thereafter Mr. Palmer had sailed for Europe. There were, however, other reasons for his sudden departure best understood to himself. Elsie Chilton's rash statement charging him with complicity in the crime connected with Dr. Fletcher had more foundation than he would have cared to own. Not that he lent himself deliberately, or in any sense of the word openly, to such a disgraceful proceeding. Nevertheless, he was unpleasantly conscious that the conception of the whole plan might possibly be traced to him. He had certainly felt bitterly angry against Dr. Fletcher for taking care to make a public and detailed statement to the effect that only those who were habitual users of stimulants could be the subject of practical jokes. It is true Dr. Fletcher did not make any such statement, but it was easy to imagine he had. Also, he was angry with Dr. Fletcher on general principles, as a man who was succeeding in the plan of life which he had mapped out for himself, and as one of a certain clique which, by tacit consent, had shut him out. That Elsie Chilton belonged to that clique was a sore point. The scowl, which had seemed to Elsie a forerunner of evil, had indeed accompanied evil thoughts. Mr. Palmer, remembering his own disgrace, which was certainly known to at least 2 persons belonging to that clique, and he could not be sure how many more, felt an almost consuming desire to make the immaculate Dr. Fletcher a marked victim to the skill of practical jokers. He went directly from the reception to a certain club meeting which was composed of young men who had money enough, and drank high-priced liquors enough, to make them dare to undertake anything, and reported as much of the conversation as he had overheard as he chose, together with quotations, highly coloured by his imagination, from the evening's addresses by Fern Redpath and Dr. Fletcher. He knew that these society young men were sufficiently under the influence of liquor at the moment to deeply resent what they would call the insult to their set. Then, when he had produced the right impression, he admitted that such people ought to be taught a lesson, and related a striking instance of getting the better of a certain man who considered himself above the common lot of mortals. The boys were deeply interested in the story, noisily applauded some portions of it, and openly declared that they should like to see that piece of perfection who considered it his business to go around giving public lectures about them, come up with, in some way. Then they actually fell to discussing how it could be managed, and someone suggested that Joe Patterson and his set could manage the dirty part, that they were up to any kind of mean work that could be imagined, and hated the temperance ring with all their hearts, and then Mr. Palmer had excused himself in some haste and gone away. As he reflected upon all this afterwards, it made the colour flame into his face to think how startlingly like the incident he had told were some of the details of Dr. Fletcher's experience. Only of course the fellows blundered. Who had supposed they would be so reckless as to narrowly escape causing the death of their victim? He had not dreamed of such a result. But suppose for a moment that some of the bunglers should be caught, and there was every reason to fear it. That Mason fellow was quick-witted and long-brained and meant to succeed. And suppose a detailed account of his conversation in the club-room that night should actually come into court. It would have an ugly sound. Of course a man could not be arrested because he had talked carelessly with a party of half-drunken fellows, but it certainly would not comport with his dignity to be cross-questioned, for instance. Perhaps by Earl Mason himself. Horrible! After giving heed to that thought for the space of a minute, Mr. Palmer hastened his departure from the country and planned to make his stay indefinite. Mr. Chilton's affairs went swiftly toward their consummation. Disaster was in the air. Almost ruin looked the troubled man in the face. Then arose a most unexpected deliverer. A business man of undoubted integrity, whose name was a power in the business world, but with whom Mr. Chilton had had very little in common, came suddenly forward and volunteered the use of his name to an almost unlimited extent. He would make no explanations as to the reason for this strange conduct, and laughed at Mr. Chilton's embarrassed and voluble efforts to be sufficiently grateful. "Why, man," he said heartily, "there is no occasion for such deep gratitude. I understand the situation perfectly. I do not expect to lose a cent by you. I am an old man, and have been through all the stages of depression and anxiety. I have been able to look into your affairs somewhat, and I see plain sailing for you in the future, with a little management just now. Therefore I offer the helping hand. It is no more than any man of common sense, who had the money lying idle, would be willing to do. It is a business transaction, done in a friendly way. There is nothing incongruous between business and friendship, Mr. Chilton." And the bewildered man of business did not know then, though he did long afterwards, that the merchant prince was the devoted friend and admirer, I might almost say lover, of the young lawyer, Earl Mason. It hardly need be added that he was also a lover of the Lord Jesus Christ, and ordered his business life, as well as all his other concerns, under the guidance of that master mind. So the financial crash was averted, and Mr. Chilton floated through, without the aid of Aleck Palmer, greatly, it must be confessed, to that gentleman's bewilderment and chagrin. Nevertheless, this did not make smooth sailing for his daughter. Obstinacy was Mr. Chilton's ruling passion. She had thwarted him, this one child of his, had overset the darling plans of his lifetime. His fortune was saved to him and to her, but the magnificent estates which might have been joined to his were lost, simply through her obstinacy. Since she would not marry Aleck Palmer, and he discovered at last that this was precisely what his daughter meant, she certainly should not marry, with his consent, that upstart of a lawyer, who had his own way to make in the world, with nothing to fall back upon, and who had made all the trouble between the other two. They had had upon this subject, he and his daughter, what Mr. Chilton called some plain English, at which time he informed her that, as she had chosen to upset all his plans, of course there was nothing to be done but to take the consequences. He meant to be perfectly frank with her. That Mason fellow had had the impudence to ask his permission to address her, for which he was glad, as it gave him an opportunity to tell him what he thought of him. If Elsie had decided to remain at home, he was entirely willing. It would probably be more pleasant to have her in the house than out of it, and he had enough to support her. But as for her marrying that Mason fellow, she must understand once for all that she would have to choose between them. She was of age, and could no doubt do as she pleased, but so could he. From the hour when she should marry that person, she might understand that he would have no more to do with her than if they were total strangers. Miss Chilton he was willing to support, but Mrs. Mason, never. His daughter listened very quietly. There was perhaps an added pallor to her face, but no surprise in look or manner. She understood her father better than he thought. When at last he gave her an opportunity to speak, her voice was very quiet. "Papa," she said, "you have certainly spoken very plainly. I will do the same. If you care to have me with you, and I think you do, I will promise never to leave you, never to marry anyone without your full and free consent. I have known for a long time that there was only one person whom I could ever marry, and that person is Mr. Mason. But I can remain unmarried, and if that will give you a little comfort, Papa, I shall be glad to stay with you always, and I will try to be as good a daughter to you as I can. I am sorry I had to act contrary to your wish, for I love you, Papa, with all my heart, and I am willing to prove it by giving up my way for your sake. I had to disappoint you, because to do other than I did, feeling as I did, would have been a sin. But you may understand now that from this time I belong to you, and I will not trouble you about this matter again." She had then stooped over the chair in which he was sitting, and touched her lips ever so lightly to his forehead, and gone away. Mr. Chilton sat there for an hour, feeling like a brute. Indeed, he frankly called himself a selfish man, more selfish than he had ever supposed he could be. Yet so carefully had he trained himself to have his own way in the world, so persistently had he refused to yield his plans in the smallest degree to others, that he presently accepted the condition of things as one accustomed to ruling, and arose at last to go to his business, feeling that his troubles were well over, and that if Elsie would settle down and be happy, they could have a pleasanter life, on the whole, than would have been possible with Palmer as a husband and son, dictating to them both. And so absorbed was he with his business, that I do not think he realized how completely he had crushed the blossoms along his daughter's path. There were two who realized it, however, and there was one woman who did not hesitate to tell Elsie that she believed she had done wrong in yielding thus to her father's unreasonable prejudices. But Earl Mason never told her so. She must be true to her conscience, he told himself with a long-drawn sigh. God forbid that I should ever come between a soul and its duty, as the Lord Jesus Christ reveals it. As soon as the autumn evenings were of sufficient length, Mr. Remington carried out one of his plans, which had been maturing all summer. That was to institute a series of gospel temperance meetings, beginning in his church. He called to his assistance a noted temperance worker, a man of energy and power, and one whose experience as a worker had been among some of the hardest classes to be found in large cities. Finding, after a brief experience, that many of the hard characters whom he was trying to reach could not be induced to enter a church building, Mr. Remington rented a hall in the heart of the city, Mr. Hargrave, Dr. Fletcher, and others of their stamp rallying around him for this purpose. Then began aggressive temperance work in a locality which was surrounded on all sides by saloons of almost every type. That the work was owned and honored of the master could be proven any night by watching the groups of blear-eyed, red-faced, fallen human beings who tarried to the after-meeting, or lingered about the door to have a word with Mr. Remington, or rose up to be prayed for when the invitation was given. Among these half-intoxicated and wholly miserable who shuffled forward one evening and knelt around the platform, having been asked to give that indication of their desire to begin a new life, was one whom Earl Mason noticed with a start, which had dismay in it as well as surprise. He was standing in the aisle waiting to speak a word to someone who he knew was weighing the question whether he should move or not, when this fellow stumbled past him. He leaned forward with one eager glance at the hard face, then bending to Mrs. Remington, who occupied an aisle chair next to him, said in an undertone, "That one who just passed you is Dan Stokes." Now Dan Stokes was a name which had power to bring terror to Mrs. Remington's soul. It was the name of the man for whom they had been looking so long and persistently. It was the name of the man who, they believed, had planned and carried out the capture of little John. The mother's face was white with pain, as the thought of those awful days, when she had lived without knowledge of her baby's whereabouts, returned to her, and she leaned forward and gazed with frightened eyes at the fellow for whom they had been so long hunting. "Are you sure?" she asked in a trembling voice. "Very sure," answered Earl Mason. "I knew the fellow quite well by sight. I wonder that he has dared to show his face here. Look, the poor wretch is kneeling, and Mr. Remington is talking with him. I do not suppose he has the least idea who it is, but the fellow must know who is bending over him, though perhaps not, he is partially intoxicated. Mrs. Remington, I feel very much like sending for an officer and arresting him at once. Shall I do so?" "No," came from Mrs. Remington's grave lips. "Not now. Not yet, at least. I do not know. How can we tell but the Lord is speaking to him? Look, my husband has dropped on his knees beside him, and is praying for him." For the remainder of the evening, Mrs. Remington had eyes only for Dan Stokes. She watched him with a frightened face and a fluttering at her heart which she could not control. She noticed that her husband kept him in sight, even after he had risen and stepped back a little from the platform. At intervals Mr. Remington would turn to speak a few words to him. When the meeting closed, as the minister caught sight of his wife, he motioned her forward. Mr. Mason, who had seen his call, made a way for her through the aisle and followed her. Do you know who you have here?" he asked, speaking low to the minister, with a significant movement of his head toward Dan Stokes, who stood with hands in his pockets and eyes on the floor, noticing no one, and seeming like the very embodiment of despair. "Yes," said Mr. Remington, in clear tones. "I know. Mattie, I want your advice. What can we do with this man? He is terribly tempted. He does not dare to go out of this building. He does not dare to promise that he will get to his attic tonight without going into some of these saloons. He is urged on by an awful appetite which makes him long for drink in a way that you and I cannot understand. He is urged on by boon companions who are determined that he shall not reform, and yet he wants to. I can feel that he does. Do you know who he is, dear? Has Mason told you? Well, what is there that I can do for him? If I had an asylum where I could take him for a few days and stand by him and help him fight this battle out, he might come off conqueror in the name of Jesus Christ. But there is no place in this city for such sorely tried souls as his." "Bring him home," said Mrs. Remington, her voice firm and resolute. "Bring him home, John, and we will help. Aunt Hannah, and little John, and I." "God bless my wife," said Mr. Remington, and his voice now quivered. Then, observing that his friend had heard every word, "What is such a wife as that worth, Mason? Will you go and get a carriage for me, large enough to hold my family and Dan Stokes, and yourself? Come with us, will you?" End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of John Remington, Martyr, by Pansy and Mrs. C.M. Livingston. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by MaryAnn. Chapter 27. The Night Cometh. "We had a hard fight," said Aunt Hannah a few days afterwards, as she sewed bright buttons all over John's kilt suit, and told the story of Dan Stokes and his experiences to Elsie Chilton. "A real downright hard fight all around. Dan Stokes has been fought for by all the demons in the pit, ever since he has been in the house. My John, bless him, did not leave the fellow day or night for 48 hours, and I believe he has come off conqueror, or rather Jesus Christ has. It has been a strange experience, Elsie. The strangest feeling I ever had in my life was when I knelt down in this room last night at family worship, and heard Dan Stokes try to pray. It was real praying, too. There was a good deal of stammering about it, of course, but I sometimes think stammering gets translated up there into language that would astonish us. You ought to have heard him pray for little John." And then Aunt Hannah's voice broke, and she stopped to wipe away the tears. "It beats all how that little fellow takes to him. He has just petted him all day long, showed him his horses and his toot-toot and his soldiers and all his pictures, and I don't know what not. He has patted his hand and brushed the hair out of his eyes and actually kissed his great rough face. That broke Dan Stokes' heart outright. He just put down his head and cried like a baby. And little John said, 'Poor man, poor sorry man, don't cry.' We have all had a victory," continued Aunt Hannah, as Elsie wiped her eyes suspiciously. "Jane and I among the others," and she glanced around at Jane, whose face grew red as she bent over the grate she was brushing, but who answered the glance with an appreciative smile. "We couldn't stand Dan Stokes at first, either of us. Jane said she couldn't abide him. She should go wild with a fear if he stayed in the house all night. And I felt a good deal so myself, though I made up his bed. But I took off the white spread and the white toilet things on the bureau and put them away. I wasn't going to stand having Dan Stokes touch any of them. And she came in, don't you think, and put the white spread on again, and fixed the toilet things, and added some more to them, and put flowers in the vase." "Jane did?" interrupted Elsie in surprise. "Jane, child! No, Martha, of course, the guardian angel of this household. She fixed things up all again as nice as she could have done for her own mother. Then she put her arms round my neck and kissed me. Says she, 'It's for his sake, dear Aunt Hannah. You know he died for Dan Stokes, and I cannot forget it.' I'll be bound if I hadn't forgot it outright. It all came over me like a flash how he would have managed, and here I wasn't willing for him to have the white spread on his bed. Well, as I say, we are all conquered. When little John kissed him, that was the end of it for me, and it was about the end of it for him too, I guess. I never saw a man cry so in my life. I made up my mind that if Jesus Christ can save Dan Stokes, and I believe he has, there is no limit to his power." Truly he was making his power visible during the days which followed. Dan Stokes, clean-shaven, cleanly dressed, standing up in the gospel temperance meetings and declaring in plain, simple words that the Lord Jesus Christ had met him on the way and saved his soul and given him a refuge from his enemy, was testimony that could not be withstood. "God bless you," said Philip King, holding his hand in a firm grasp one evening. "You've got hold of the right helper, Brother Stokes. He will carry you through, provided you trust him entirely. You know me, don't you? I was a worse drunkard than you, lower down, in a sense, for I had better opportunities in life to sin against. I tried all sorts of reforms, and I couldn't reform any more than a drowning man can keep himself from drowning. Then I tried Jesus Christ halfway. Partly I trusted him, and partly I trusted in the good resolutions of Philip King. That was a failure. Good resolutions, unless they are built on the rock Christ Jesus, are walls of sand. Then I tried him in a way which I know now to be presumption. I walked into temptation when I could have gone the other way, and expected him to save me. Stokes, I don't believe he ever will do it. There is a sense in which the Lord expects us to do our part, and our part is that which we can do. You and I know there are places we cannot do, and those he looks after. Do you get my meaning?" "Aye," said Dan Stokes, brushing away the tears. "I understand, and I mean to keep out of temptation as much as I can in this awful world. It is an awful world for fellows like me, now isn't it? I have to pass 17 saloons on my way home from work, but I know what you mean. They told me you got tempted inside the church walls. I won't have that to fight against. I'm going to be in Mr. Remington's church, sir, and he won't have no temptation of that kind in any church where he goes. Maybe you don't know him?" "Indeed I do," answered Philip King, his eyes lighting. "I know him, Stokes, but only the Lord himself knows all that he has done for me." "That is," said Dan Stokes, "words won't tell it, they won't. But I'm going to give my life, I am, to showing him and his wife and his boy that they have saved me. It is the greatest wonder to me yet that they could care to have me saved. But they did, even the little fellow. 'Poor sorry man,' he said, 'don't cry.'" And then Dan Stokes got out his clean white handkerchief and wiped away the tears. 2 more wonderful weeks passed. The gospel temperance meetings were still in full tide of power, when Mr. Remington left them one evening in charge of others, and went to answer a call to another part of the city, where there was a political rally. "Gospel temperance is all very well," said the man who had come to urge for his help. "I believe in it with all my soul. You know that as well as anybody, but so do the saloon men, if you don't go any further. That is, they are willing you should pray a good deal, and sing as many gospel hymns as you please. They can even stand the conversion of Dan Stokes and a few fellows like him, who have spent all their money in the saloons. They are willing to tolerate all this if you will let their votes alone. They are more or less mad, it is true, at all temperance workers, on general principles. But the people for whom they have a downright and ever-increasing dislike, to put it mildly, are the people who touch the political side of the question. They don't understand the power of prayer, and are therefore not so much afraid of it, but the power of a vote they can appreciate. Just as long as they can keep the praying on one side and the voting on the other, they consider themselves comparatively safe." But Mr. Remington, in his speech that night, by no means kept the praying on one side and the voting on the other. "Vote as you pray" might almost have been said to be the text of the sermon he preached. A strong, keen, logical sermon, addressed to keen-brained men, voters every one of them, men who listened intently and weighed carefully the problems which he presented before them, and the facts and the figures with which he clinched his arguments. The man who had called for him walked back with him to the hall when the 20 minutes' speech was concluded. "You did some good work for the cause tonight, Mr. Remington," he said. "That speech will give us a dozen more votes at least, I believe, and we are getting where a dozen more votes will tell. We are gaining on the enemy, Mr. Remington, as sure as the world. If we could only have all the church members with us, how quickly we would sweep this curse out of the land." "Yes," said Mr. Remington, and he could not forbear a sigh. Even in his own beloved church there were many men who loved him, and prayed with and for him, and who worked earnestly in the gospel temperance meetings, and were honest to the heart's core, he knew, yet who would in a few days go to the polls and array themselves against him on the side of the saloons which he and they were fighting. "It is very strange," he said. "It is the problem of the centuries how to understand the honest Christian people of our country on this question. There is nothing like it. We see eye to eye on every other moral question under the sun. I do not understand it. The utmost I can do is to work and pray and wait. I am willing to do the working and praying," he added, with a slight laugh, "but there are some of my people for whom it seems hard to wait." "I know," answered his friend. "I know precisely how you feel. I have a brother, as good a man as ever lived, as good as gold, and as square as he can be on all other questions, as you say. But when it comes to this, there isn't a bat in the world as blind as he. It is unaccountable to me, except on the principle that the God of this world has blinded his eyes. When I get to thinking about it, and get all wrought up, as you have wrought me up tonight, Mr. Remington, by your speech, the only language in which I can express myself is the old cry, 'O Lord, how long?'" Then they reached the door of the hall where the temperance meeting was still in progress, and shook hands and separated. A few steps away, then the gentleman turned and called out, "Oh, hold on, Brother Remington. I forgot one or two things. Do you have a service tomorrow evening?" "Yes, sir, service every evening," said Mr. Remington, in exultant tone. These gospel meetings, held night after night, with as much persistence as the saloons, were his soul's delight. "Can you get away and go down to the South End for a few moments' talk, as you have given tonight?" "Oh, yes, I can go for a little while. I have good helpers in these meetings." "All right, thank you. And how about Sunday? Can you give us a little gospel temperance talk, say 15 minutes or so, at the South End Mission, for the young people, the boys, who will be voters in another year or two, you know?" "Yes," said Mr. Remington, again speaking hastily. "Yes, I can. I am glad to speak to the boys every chance I can get. The boys who will vote in a year or two, or 3, are the hope of our country today. Your meeting is at 4, is it not? I will be there, if nothing unforeseen prevents." It was nearly 2 hours later when Mr. Remington was taking swift strides up the street, making all speed to catch the last car which would go out his way that night. The meeting had been long closed, but he had tarried to have a little after-meeting talk with a half a dozen evil-looking men, who yet looked better this night than they had before in months, some of them in years, in that they were sober, and had within them a weak longing after a better life. 2 of them in particular held Mr. Remington late. Their lines in life were hard. They had families, little children. They were very poor. They were weak in body through long dissipation, unable to work much, had work been at their hands. They needed good food and care, and kindness and patience, such as Jesus Christ, had he been on earth, would, without question, have bestowed. And Mr. Remington, who was coming into daily and hourly contact with just such cases, felt at times almost in despair, because Jesus Christ, in the person of his church, was willing to do so little for such as these. Since the world was what it was, how were such as these to be saved? He took a cross-cut through one of the darker by-streets of the city, revolving the problem as he went. How to meet the needs of these men, who with feeble effort were reaching toward reform? How to tide them over the gulf which lay between them and respectability? How to steer them past the many open doors of saloons wooing them with brilliant lights, and sounds of laughter and good cheer, and odors which enticed them in a way that men like himself could not understand? "If I only had a house," he said aloud, "a home of my own that I could make into a sort of earthly refuge for even a few of them at a time, and tide them over. If we had a home in which to put a man like Philip King, what could not he and his wife and little Carol do for tempted souls? Oh, for some of the millions that are being wasted in this city. If I could have—" But the sentence was never finished. He had been conscious for several minutes of steps behind him, moving rapidly as he did, crossing streets when he crossed, vaguely conscious of it, not attaching any special importance to it. He halted near a street lamp and drew his watch to time himself as to the probability of his securing the last car. He was but 2 blocks away from it now, and the footsteps gained on him. He struck into an alley, which would take him by a still shorter route to the avenue. The footsteps followed him. It was just as he said to himself, "If I could have," that there came the sharp report of a pistol shot, startling the quiet air, and then another following it in quick succession. But apparently there had been no need of that second one, for with the first Mr. Remington had fallen to the ground. The alley was dark and deserted. The footsteps that had dogged him had no difficulty in turning and fleeing in the direction whence they had come. They were lost even to sound by the time the policeman, stationed near the corner, could reach the spot, though he made all speed in the direction of the sound which had startled him. As he bent over the prostrate man, he uttered an exclamation in dismay. "It's the preacher!" Then he whistled for help. At the parsonage, Mrs. Remington and her friends were quietly awaiting the homecoming of the head of the house. Mrs. Remington had not been down to the evening meeting, and Elsie Chilton, who was spending several days with her, had been attended home from the first meeting by Earl Mason. Dr. and Mrs. Fletcher were also there, having driven out after the service to enjoy a few minutes' chat. "We ought not to have come out here tonight," said Dr. Fletcher, consulting his watch. "Of course we knew we would stay too late if we came, but I thought Mr. Remington would be at home before this, and I wanted to see him a moment about that committee work he has set me at." "He meant to be home early," said Mrs. Remington. "He said he meant to plan to work a little in the study this evening. He is not ready for the Sabbath, and expects an unusually busy day tomorrow with outside duties. Something extra must have occurred to detain him so late tonight." "Those half-dozen men who went into the second meeting are the unexpected detentions, depend on it," answered Earl Mason. "One of them is a fellow for whom he has been watching and praying for weeks. He enjoys the reputation of being one of the hardest cases in the city. He will need a great deal of help and care tonight, I presume. I suspect I ought to have stayed to see what I could do towards caring for him, but I was too sorely tempted." This last undertone with a smile for Elsie. There were times when this young man thought that the lines of his life were fallen in hard places. The woman he loved, and who loved him, was as hopelessly shut away from him as she had ever been. He did not feel at liberty to visit her in her father's house, at least he did not feel comfortable in doing so, and they were, most of the time, dependent upon chance meetings at Mr. Remington's or at Dr. Fletcher's. Mrs. Remington was greatly tried about the whole matter. "It is perfectly unnatural," she assured her husband, "and the whole thing will have to be righted in some way. I don't know how, I am sure. I do not want Mr. Chilton to die, and yet—" Here she came to a sudden stop. "And yet, my dear, you could consent to even that affliction for the good of the cause. Is that your meaning?" her husband had asked, smiling. "No, but really, John, something ought to be done. 2 lives like theirs ought not to be wasted in that way." "Something will be done," he had answered. "In his own good time, all that is wrong will be righted, Mattie dear. We must trust him for Elsie as well as for ourselves." It was growing very late. Dr. Fletcher looked again at his watch and started up, announcing that they must go at once. "And by the way," he added, "there goes the last uptown car for the night. Was not Mr. Remington coming in it?" "There is no accounting for Mr. Remington," Earl Mason answered lightly. "He doubtless thinks he is, but in 9 cases out of 10 it is my opinion that he loses the last car and has to come on foot, which will be my fate if I tarry longer." "Hark!" said Mrs. Remington. "Someone is coming. That must be John. Why, there are several coming on the steps. Do you suppose he has brought the half-dozen home with him? If he has, you must all stay and help them get settled for the night." By this time Dr. Fletcher, who had been standing near the window, uttered an exclamation and started for the hall, followed closely by Earl Mason. Mrs. Remington looked after them in surprise, turned one bewildered glance upon Mrs. Fletcher and Elsie, and asked, "Do they think anything is wrong?" Then she too went toward the hall, in time to see the tall forms of 2 policemen carrying something very tenderly in their strong arms. "He is not dead," said Dr. Fletcher, turning hastily toward her. "He has been injured and has fainted from loss of blood. You must be very brave, Mrs. Remington. You are needed to care for him." And it was Mrs. Remington who led the way up the stairs, and prepared the bed, and brought scissors and wet cloths and restoratives, and obeyed swiftly and silently the brief and hurried directions of the doctor. End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of John Remington, Martyr, by Pansy and Mrs. C.M. Livingston. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by MaryAnn. Chapter 28. The Upper Chamber. "Will he die?" asked Mrs. Fletcher, clutching at her husband's arm as soon as she could get speech with him. "Paul, is it a mortal wound?" "I do not know, dear, yet. I cannot tell." He was hurriedly writing a few lines on a piece of paper as he spoke, and now handed it to Earl Mason. "Take my carriage," he said, "and I need not tell you to make all speed. This note will explain to my assistant boy what is needed. Bring Thurston back with you, and Delafield if you can find him." The gray dawn of the November morning was creeping in at the eastern window before Dr. Fletcher turned from his charge with a faint smile for the wife who had been speechless, tearless, and efficient during all those terrible hours, watching, waiting for she knew not what. "We hope he will live, Mrs. Remington," he said. "We have not dared to say so before." "Mamma!" cried a wondering voice at the chamber door, And little John in his white woolen gown, his curls all in a lovely tangle, and his face with the flush of sleep still upon it, looked in with astonished eyes upon the scene. His mother made haste to him, gathered him in her arms, buried her face in his curls, and wet them with the first tears which had come to relieve her burning eyes during all the night vigil. Yes, he lived, but it was days before they were sure of it. Long, terrible days, and more terrible nights, when the valuable life hung in the balance, and it seemed as if a hair's breadth would turn the scales. During all this time, excitement ran high in the city. Men of all shades of belief and unbelief united to express their horror of the crime, and gathered in groups and in societies and in clubs to discuss the terrible questions of how and why. They organized vigilance committees whose avowed purpose it was to seek the murderer and to bring him to justice. Resolutions were passed by the dozen, and indignant men declared that the thought that such deeds were possible was a disgrace to civilization, and said that the would-be murderer was drunk, of course. No man in the possession of his senses would ever have been guilty of such a cold-blooded, cowardly, unprovoked outrage as that. And then they voted, some of them, some of these very men, and within a few days' time, to license more liquor saloons. Not all of them. Not all even of those who had been in the habit of voting the license ticket were counted on that side in the election. The first bit of news Earl Mason ventured to tell the wounded man was that the ward about which he had felt most anxious, and for which he had worked the hardest, had had a temperance victory in the last election. Directly traceable to your address that night, he added eagerly. The vote was close, and if 3 men, who it was said changed their views that night, had not done so, we should have lost it. And then he wondered if he should add another item of news, to the effect that the mystery connected with the assault upon Dr. Fletcher was solved, and the leading conspirators were now awaiting trial. He reflected that he would not. There was an element of pain in that bit of news. 2 of the men were those for whom Mr. Remington had prayed and worked much. Of course they ought to be punished for their crime, but it was the old story. If they had not been in liquor, they would never have been guilty of such a deed. What need to tell the man who had tried so hard to save them of the depth of their fall? It is really Alec Palmer who ought to suffer in their stead, the young lawyer muttered, for the developments connected with the trial were to be fully as disgraceful as that European gentleman had imagined they might be. Mr. Remington lived, but what a shattered life it was. The first time his wife was told about it, that the beautiful strong limb, which had been swift to go with its fellows upon errands of love and mercy all these years, must be cut away as the only hope of saving the precious life, she shut herself into her own private room for hours. She did not dare to look upon her husband's face. She could not even take little John into her arms. She had to go away to be alone with Christ, and fight the battle out with her rebellious, breaking heart. How could she have him in his strong young manhood, in the full glory of his successful work, broken and maimed before her, a cripple for life? Yes, more than a cripple. She had known for several days that the spine was injured, and that the doctors feared he might not walk in a long, long time. Now he could never walk, except possibly to hobble around on crutches, and even that was very doubtful. Her brave, strong athlete, in whose unusual strength she had so gloried, to be shot down in the night by a drunken wretch, one of those whom he was spending his life to save. How could she have it so? How could this Christian nation tolerate the curse which had made such an experience possible? Nay, there was a harder battle than that to fight. The poor, hard-pressed, trembling woman was assaulted even on her knees by the powers of darkness gathering under the banner of that one awful question. How could God be good and have it so? Why? Why had he let this horror of suffering and helplessness come upon this young willing servant? She came off the victor. Oh, you know that. He never leaves his own for the enemy to vanquish. But she had to fight the battle on her knees in bitterness of soul, and to cry out again and again, "Though he slay me, yet I will trust in him." She came out from that closed room a victorious woman, and answered the smile on her husband's face, and his murmured, "Mattie, darling, is it all right?" with a steady, "Yes, it is all right," and added with a sort of solemn triumph in her voice, and they rejoiced that they were counted worthy to suffer shame for his name. The weeks went by. The sacrifice was made, and by Christmas time the wreck of the once splendid form, with his right leg gone and his left arm partially paralyzed, and his back too weak to sit erect, could yet rest among the pillows of the curiously constructed chair planned for such as he, and smile, and visit with his friends, and inquire after the cause. He was full of cheer, the lightest-hearted one, apparently, of all the group that gathered round him. "He has never once broken down," said Mrs. Remington to Elsie, "neither before Aunt Hannah nor myself. He has never spoken other than cheerfully, I might almost say joyfully, of his future. He begins the day with a merry word for little John, and ends it with a prayer of thanksgiving for mercies, in a strain as cheery as though his life did not stretch out before him with all its hopes and plans crushed. My husband is a perpetual wonder to me." Earl Mason heard the words, but made no sign that he could tell a different story. He had seen Mr. Remington once, when he had broken down. They were alone together, and had been quiet for some minutes, when the minister said suddenly, "The night cometh when no man can work. I was writing a sermon on that text when my night came. I am not to preach any more." Then he had closed his eyes, and one by one the tears had followed each other slowly down his face, and Earl Mason had felt that he had not a word to say, that there were no human words which would not sound like mockery. He had walked to the window, both to hide his own tears and to let Mr. Remington feel that he was not being watched. Only a few minutes afterwards he had heard the voice of the sick man again with the quiver gone out of it. "Forgive me, Brother Mason, and come back. I did not mean to hurt you so. What matters it, dear brother? I can pray, thank the Lord I can pray, and there are others who can preach. The Lord does not need me in my pulpit, does not want me there, or he would have spared me. Surely I do not want to preach against his will." "There is some one preaching," Earl Mason had told him a few days after this, "of whom you will be glad to hear. Philip King has spoken every night this week at the Southside Mission, spoken grandly. He has a great power over those poor fellows. They are rallying around him, and he is throwing himself with all his soul into the work. He says he must help fill your place as much as he can, Brother Remington." "Thank the Lord," said Mr. Remington heartily. "My ministry of pain is bearing fruit already, then. Philip King has a rare power in that direction. He will reach men whom I could not. If I have been permitted to start him in his work, the Lord has been very good to me." "You are especially privileged, Mrs. Remington," Dr. Fletcher said to her one day, as he came out from the large, bright room where by degrees they were gathering all sunny and beautiful things with which to surround their beloved. "You are especially privileged. You can spend your days with a Christian martyr, one of the most beautiful witnesses to the power of the religion of Jesus Christ that I have seen in all my experience." "Yes," said Earl Mason, as the two walked down the street together, having gone 2 blocks in utter silence. "Yes, that is a good name for him. John Remington, martyr. I will tell you a good text to accompany the name. It must needs be that offences come, but woe unto that man by which they come. If the Christian world had done its duty, there would have been no need for such martyrdom, Dr. Fletcher." It is a marvelous thing, when one stops to think of it, how soon life can accommodate itself to great and startling changes. Before the new year was a month old, it might almost have seemed that in the Remington home there had always been a large, sunny room, furnished with special reference to a permanent occupant, and an invalid chair, and a man in the prime of life, with a pale face, and one nearly helpless arm, and one foot resting on the cushion arranged for it, always sitting there, with books and papers and writing material convenient to his touch. They were not to move from the parsonage, as in the first bewildering days it had been supposed of course they would have to do. Mr. Hargrave and 2 or 3 others had attended to that. Instead, the young minister who had been called to fill the vacant pulpit had been installed in the home as one of the family, welcomed with rare delight by every member of it, especially by little John, who, it was declared, acted precisely as though he remembered him. And really there was, perhaps, nothing so very strange about that, for had not Mr. Porter given him devoted and undivided attention for one long-to-be-remembered day? And had he not declared that he would like to adopt the boy for his very own? For all practical purposes it was an adoption. At least, the reverend gentleman became little John's most devoted and submissive slave, trying in a way which certainly had its pathetic side to do for the boy all that a strong-limbed, active, thoughtful father might have been supposed to do. Neither was there necessity for any especially anxious hours concerning the future. "We haven't got bread and clothes to worry about, anyhow," Aunt Hannah had said. "We have enough, child, for all of us, until little John gets old enough to take care of us. It is all yours, of course. Whose would it be?" But it was soon found that the brave little church had taken care of that matter, and had voted to the disabled pastor a life salary to be paid in regular quarterly installments. "I am young to be a senior pastor," he had said with a brave smile to Mr. Porter when they conferred together, and he had been answered with a smile as bright as his own. "Yes, we are young men together. I am but a trifle younger than you are yourself, and together we will shoulder this church, Brother Remington, and make it a power for God in the world. You are the senior pastor, that is the church's vote, and I am the co-pastor. I rejoiced in that vote. It is as it should be. I glory in the union, and I warn you, brother, I expect to lean upon you, for although you are not much older in years, you are, you remember, in experience, and you have had rare successes with this church. And besides, brother, do you not think that to those whom the Lord calls to witness for him in the baptism of suffering, he gives a double portion of his Spirit?" So, all things considered, there was a great deal of sunshine in the upper room, beyond that which the grand luminary in the sky made for it. And the brave man in his chair took up his long laid-aside literary work again, began to study and think and write, with a view to reaching the outside world through his pen, since he could not longer by his voice. He said one day to Mr. Mason, with that rarely sweet smile of his, "I do not know but I am to preach, brother, after all. I've been lying here this afternoon and thinking of the little word I wrote about Christ last week, which is in the newspaper today, and which thousands of people may have read by next week this time. I made it a sermon straight from my heart. Perhaps the Master will let me preach it to a larger congregation than I could ever have reached from the pulpit." One evening, Mrs. Remington, having presided over the dainty dinner which had been sent upstairs, and which little John and his father enjoyed together, that graceless young man, if he thought anything about it, doubtless rejoicing that at last there had been a rival dinner-table set up which he was permitted to honor with his presence, had come downstairs to do the honors of the table spread in the dining-room, for both Earl Mason and Elsie Chilton were her guests that evening. Just as the dinner-bell sounded its summons, the door-bell was also heard. "Go down to dinner, Aunt Hannah, please, with our friends," Mrs. Remington said. "I will wait and see what is wanted. If it should be someone to see John, I shall have to attend to it, you know." So they had all gone downstairs while she waited in the back parlor for a summons, and presently stepped nearer to the gaslight to see if her eyes did not deceive her in regard to the name on the card at which she was gazing. Robert L. Chilton. That could certainly mean none other than Elsie's father. What possible errand could have brought him thither? He had never honored them with a call since their return to the city. Mrs. Remington had met him but once in all those months, and was then recognized only by the coldest and most formal of bows. She felt embarrassed and troubled at the thought of meeting him. She feared that his errand portended some fresh annoyance to Elsie. Did he know, she wondered, that his daughter and her dearest friend met very often under her roof, and did he possibly resent her attempts to smooth the hardness of the path he had obliged Elsie to tread? She drew herself up proudly as she thought of it. If he had come to lecture her, he would discover that he had chosen the wrong person. Poor Elsie might be his victim, if she would. For herself, she would speak plain truths if he gave her an opportunity. Certainly she had no fear of Mr. Chilton. Then she went forward to meet him, a very dignified little woman, bristling inwardly with a desire to speak her mind, the more she thought about it, really tempted to hope that she should have an opportunity. His first words disarmed her. "Good evening, Mrs. Remington. Would it be possible for me to see your husband for a few minutes? I have a very great need to have a little talk with him." He hesitated before the word need, and seemed to use it advisedly. Had he asked to have his daughter Elsie brought to him immediately, that he might cloak, bonnet, and carry her home like a disgraced child? Or had he asked to have Earl Mason presented before him that he might horsewhip him, Mrs. Remington felt that she would have been prepared. but to ask in tones which were actually almost tremulous if he might see her husband embarrassed her. She knew not what to do or say. She stammered out some incoherent reply, and finally succeeded in seating her guest. Then she went with all haste to John. "Mr. Chilton," he said, stopping in his frolic with Little John to hear his wife's words. "Why, certainly, my dear, I shall be glad to see him. You may show him up at once, but I think perhaps you had better take Little John away. He may entertain him too vigorously." So Little John, to his grief, was consigned to Jane, and Mr. Chilton was escorted to the bright room, where Mrs. Remington left him with her husband, and betook herself in a bewildered frame of mind to the dining-room. She was clear in regard to only one point, namely, that she would keep silence as to who was John's guest, lest all sorts of surmises might be awakened in Elsie's mind, and her visit be spoiled. Meantime she could not keep herself from wondering what was going on upstairs, and her wonderment would have deepened had she been there. End of chapter 28. Chapter 29 of John Remington, Martyr, by Pansy and Mrs. C.M. Livingston. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by MaryAnn. Chapter 29. Ottissey First. "How do you do, sir?" Mr. Remington had said, in the old cheery tones which his caller remembered so well, and he had reached forth his hand as he spoke. "I cannot rise to meet you, you see, but I am very glad to welcome you. Draw your chair nearer the grate, will you not? The night is very cold, they tell me." Thus much Mrs. Remington had heard before she closed the door. She had heard no reply. Neither, indeed, had Mr. Remington. Mr. Chilton, who looked much older than the younger man had imagined him, and who had apparently grown feeble, dropped himself into the depths of the easy-chair, and said not one word. This was embarrassing, but his host talked on, resolved to give him time to recover his breath, if that was what was amiss with him. "The winter has finally set in with great severity. They tell me the sleighing is very good, and judging from the clouds there is a prospect of still more snow. Is that not an unusual state of things in this region?" Still no reply. It was growing very embarrassing. Mr. Remington turned to keep his eyes upon his guest, whose chair was a little in the shadow, he having pushed it so that his back was to the firelight. Was it possible that there were tears in the faded blue eyes? Presently the old man, I use the adjective advisedly, for he seemed that night an old man, drew his handkerchief and deliberately wiped his eyes, only to have them fill again. Mr. Remington now regarded him with great concern. "I beg your pardon, my dear friend," he said with respectful sympathy. "I see that you are in sorrow, and I did not know it. Has any trouble come to you, sir, and can I help you in any way?" It was so natural for this man to offer help. It flushed his face a little, the moment he had spoken the words, to remember how helpless he was himself. Then in another moment he had thought with a little exultant thrill, "I can pray." At last Mr. Chilton had found his voice, broken it was, and husky. "Mr. Remington, I have to beg your pardon. I did not know I was so weak. The sight of you, sir, has unmanned me. I did not realize it was so bad, and I do not know how to tell my story, but my heart is all broken down, and my pride and my remorse is very great. I have had to come to you. I was driven to it. You do not know it, sir, but I was the cause of your terrible injury. I blame myself for it all." "My dear friend," and Mr. Remington's voice was full of astonishment and incredulity, "how has it been possible for you to work yourself into such an idea as that? It was some poor drunken creature who arrested my steps. I felt his shadow following me long before I realized any danger. I know perfectly the slouching gait and the uncouth appearance of the man. I almost think I could recognize him if he were brought before me, though I did not see his face. What has led you to conceive such a mistaken idea, sir?" Mr. Chilton shook his head sorrowfully. "I feel only too sure of it," he said. "I will tell you just how it was. I was present that night when you made your address, down at the lower hall. It was a critical time with us. There were some political questions at stake which we felt sure would affect our business. and some of us businessmen were painfully anxious, and could not but feel that your talk would help turn the vote in the wrong direction for us. We were very much excited, and I was the next speaker on the program, chosen to present our side of the question. I felt that a good deal depended upon me, and those who had put me in that position were watching me. My excitement was so great that some of the time I hardly knew what I was saying. I spoke very severely of you. Not by name, of course, but plainly enough for all present to understand. I spoke more severely, much more, than I had intended, and reflected upon your leaving your legitimate work to dabble in politics. I said a great many things which I afterward regretted, though I was sincere enough at the time. But I had no idea, not the remotest, what wild passions I was feeding. I thought I was speaking to honourable men who would fight with their tongues and their votes only. Coming out of the hall I met a villainous-looking fellow. I knew him as a sort of ringleader of a bad set. Ordinarily he would have passed me without a word, and I him without recognition. But I wasn't myself that night, and when he said to me, "Mr. Chilton, what is needed is a little cold lead to settle these meddling parsons," I replied in my excitement and anger, "It will come to that before long, I have no doubt." But I had not a thought, Mr. Remington, of the meaning which might be attached to my words, not the faintest idea that they would be applied in any way, and my horror and despair when I heard the next morning of the terrible crime cannot be imagined by one who has not had it to suffer. Now you know why I feel so sure that I am responsible for your condition, but you cannot know the months of agony which I have spent because of that knowledge. Mr. Remington responded by a genial smile and spoke rapidly. "My dear brother Chilton, believe me, you are suffering unnecessarily. We have enough burdens to bear in this world, my friend, without adding to them by our own imaginings. Surely in your quietest moments you feel that something more than a passing remark from an excited gentleman swayed the man who has laid me aside. It was a deliberately planned and prepared attack, and the fellow covered up his retreat with skill, and unquestionably had accomplices to aid him. I cannot think for a moment that a hasty remark, made in the heat of the excitement which follows political debate, had anything to do with the tragedy of that night. And, brother, let me beg that you will put it away from your thoughts as something with which you did not have to do." "I cannot," answered Mr. Chilton, with lips which quivered, and he wiped his eyes again, that were dim with tears. "I cannot put it away. It haunts me day and night. I know, Mr. Remington, that your life was valuable, that you were doing a great work for the Church, and for the cause of Christianity, and that your motives were pure. And to think I should have come in and stopped it all, and set you down in your room to live a life that is worse than death, is a terrible thought. I do not know how you can forgive me, sir, and yet I came to ask you to forgive me." Mr. Remington shut his lips together suddenly, in a curious repressive way that he had, and they were almost colourless. His guest had touched a wound, and, as it were, laid it bare for the moment, and set his nerves to trembling. There were dark hours in his days when he felt set aside to a life that was worse than death. His friends had all been brave before him, and had spoken no such words. But this excited man was thinking only of himself and his pain, and did not realize how he was stabbing the wounds. There was only a moment of silence. To Mr. Remington it was one of prayer, and then his voice was clear and steady. "My brother, I still think you have made yourself responsible for that which was, in no sense of the word, your work. Nevertheless, since you mention the word, let me assure you that if I have anything to forgive, I forgive it freely, fully, and with all my soul, as I hope for forgiveness for the many mistakes of my own life. God bless you, brother, and give you in these latter days a perfect understanding of Him who has power to hush all the tumults of this life of ours, and to set our eyes steadily toward the light of home. It is only a little while, my brother. The longest life is a short one, when we remember eternity." Now the tears dropped unchecked from the faded blue eyes, and Mr. Chilton's voice was very tremulous. "I cannot feel in that way, Mr. Remington. I have lived a good many more years than you have, and have had what men call a successful life. But it has not been a happy one, sir, and as it nears its close, I am very far from happy. I am losing my hold on the present, breaking physically before my time, and I feel that I have no hold at all upon the future. I am an officer in the church, as you know, sir, and I used to think I was a Christian. But it is years since I have had any comfort in the Christian life, and of late, within a very few months indeed, I have begun to feel that I know nothing about it. I look back over my past, and I cannot tell where I began to have no deep interest in such matters, or no joy in them. I do not know where the false steps were in the first place, nor how to retrace them. I am a very unhappy man, sir, and since this terrible affliction has come upon you, I have not seen a quiet hour. I resolved today that I could endure it no longer alone, that I must go to someone for help, and that I would come to you and tell you the whole wretched story, and get your advice, if there is anything that I can do to—" "Begin again, brother," interrupted Mr. Remington, his voice full of tender sympathy. "Never mind the past. The story of our past is wretched enough, always. If we had to get our comfort from that, we would be of all men most miserable. Never mind how far back the first false step was taken. Let it all go, and come to Jesus Christ. Give all the mistakes and the miseries into His keeping, and take His righteousness in their place. Never mind whether you were a Christian a year ago, or 2 years ago, or 40 years ago. Be a Christian now, tonight. Give yourself to the Lord just as though this were your first and His first contract together, and live for today and tomorrow, not for yesterday. The Lord Jesus Christ is the only friend to whom we can come in this way. All others need explanations, but He knows the whole story so much better than we do, that all He asks is the longing cry of the soul, reaching out after Him. Brother Chilton, will you get down on your knees, here and now, and give yourself to Christ in everlasting covenant?" There was a moment of intense silence, such as could be felt. Then the one who could kneel bowed himself before the Lord, and the other, with head bowed on his hand, began to pray. Mrs. Remington and her guests lingered long at the dinner table that evening, she with her ears attent for her husband's bell. On the new programme by which the family ordered its life, it was set down that when Mr. Remington had a caller whose business was not personal, and whom it would be pleasant to meet socially, or when he was disengaged and ready for company, he was to touch the bell which connected him with the back parlour. Then any one who belonged to the family, or any guest so familiar as to be almost included in the family, could go up to the bright room if he chose, and help make a family circle. Moreover, since little John had arrived at the dignity of sitting up until 7 o'clock, it had been the custom to gather in the father's room soon after the dinner hour for family worship. On this evening, after they had at last adjourned to the parlour, Mrs. Remington listened and wondered. Could Mr. Chilton be making so long a stay, or had Jane attended him to the door? If so, why did not her husband's bell ring? What could have been the object of the call? If the guest were still there, he must be wearing John out, and his errand must be private, or somebody would be called to help entertain him. Once she went halfway up the stairs, resolved to see how matters were, but returned to the parlour irresolute. It might be a private matter, and Mr. Chilton was a strange man. Twice she opened her lips to suggest to Mr. Porter that perhaps Mr. Remington would like to see him, and decided that she would not. Meantime she entertained 2 ladies who called to inquire how the invalid was, and went to the hall to be interviewed by Dan Stokes, who was Mr. Remington's devoted friend, I might almost say slave, and who never let a day go by without calling to see if there were anything he could do to serve this family. Very often, indeed, he was shown into the upper room, and had a helpful little talk with his minister, as he always called Mr. Remington. "Good evening, Mr. Stokes," Mrs. Remington said. "We are all very well tonight, thank you, and there is nothing special to be done, except to mail these letters, if you please. I cannot ask you upstairs. I think Mr. Remington has a caller, but I will give him your message and tell him you are as faithful as ever." Then she returned to the parlour, smiling. "Dan Stokes is a constant joy and rest to my husband," she explained to Mr. Porter. "Mr. Remington's brand, Dr. Fletcher calls him. How can people, looking on at the transformation in such lives as his, and Philip King's, and a host of others, for that matter, doubt the power of God to save to the uttermost? Just then Mr. Remington's bell sounded, and she turned quickly toward the hall, Little John close at her side. "You had better not come up," she said, "until I ring. I do not know whether Mr. Remington wishes us all tonight or not. He had a caller while we were at dinner, but if I ring the bell in a few minutes, you may consider yourselves invited up to prayers." Perhaps 10 minutes passed, and once more the bell gave its summons. "There," said Elsie, rising briskly from the piano, where her fingers had been idly toying with the keys while she talked to Earl Mason, who was looking through piles of music for a favourite song. "Now the rest of the children can go upstairs. Come, Aunt Hannah." Mrs. Remington threw open the door to receive them, but on the threshold Elsie paused, her fair face slowly flushing even to her temples. Could that be her father sunken in the depths of the easy-chair, very near Mr. Remington? How old and worn he looked, yet there was a peculiar light in his eyes and a strangely subdued expression on his face. Why was he here? And was he going to remain to family worship? How very strange! It is true it was the habit of the house to invite any guest who called at this hour to join with them, but that it should be her father was almost beyond belief. "Come in," said Mrs. Remington, smiling. "And for little John's sake we must make our service brief tonight. It is already past 7, and the Sandman must be very near the door. Aunt Hannah, you remember Mr. Chilton, I think? Reverend Mr. Porter, Mr. Chilton. Now, Elsie, sing 'Blessed be the tie that binds.'" It was Mr. Remington's voice which led in the prayer that followed the song, and Elsie's tears dropped fast as she listened to his petitions for the brother pilgrim whose feet had trodden the paths of earth longer than any of theirs, and who this night set his face anew toward the sunlight, with fixed purpose of heart from this time forth to be entirely the Lord's. Could he possibly mean her father? Or was he speaking of some other caller who had been there that day? For Elsie Chilton knew that this upper chamber was becoming a very Bethel for tired souls. Yet certainly the prayer sounded as if the one prayed for was close at hand. Had something wonderful and beautiful happened to her? It was a very tender prayer, like a son holding converse with the father he loved, like a brother drawing into close fellowship with the elder brother, and there was an undertone of jubilation in it that did not escape the ears of any present. The moment they arose from their knees, word came that Mr. Porter was being waited for downstairs, and he excused himself at once. Mr. Mason went forward, bowing to Mr. Chilton as he passed, and bent over Mr. Remington's chair with the usual inquiries as to his welfare and commands, for Mr. Remington called Earl Mason his telephone communication with the other world. Elsie advanced timidly, uncertain what to say to her father. She had little John by the hand, and wondered if her father had noticed him. He used to love little children, and there had been a little boy who died, around whom his heartstrings had twined, but that was long ago, and he had of late been so cold to her that she hardly knew how to approach him. "Good evening, Papa," she began, and then little John took matters into his own hands. With a firm placing of his slippered foot on the lounging chair, he said with grave decision, "Little John will sit with this grandpa," and without further words mounted upon Mr. Chilton's knee. Aunt Hannah looked dismayed and took a step forward to relieve their guest, but by that time Mr. Chilton's arm was around the boy, and with his grey head touching the yellow curls, he was whispering softly to him, Little John listening with a pleased air of condescension and approval. Aunt Hannah turned away with a relieved smile. There was no accounting for Little John's movements, and there were no hearts apparently which he did not steal. A moment more, and Earl Mason lifted himself from his brief conference with the head of the house, and said as he looked at his watch, "Well, good friends, if there is nothing I can do for any of you, I must be excused, I think. I am to take the 9 o'clock hour at the mission tonight, and I shall have not much more than time to reach there. I will report to you in the morning, sir," turning again to Mr. Remington, "how that matter stands, and will make the statement to the committee tonight which you suggested. Now, little John, will you give me a kiss for good night?" Little John puckered his rosy lips into the form of a kiss, and was just about to graciously grant the favour, when his eye alighted upon Elsie standing beside her father, one hand resting on the arm of his chair, and his fertile brain prepared on the instant a new programme. "Kiss Ottissey first," he said gravely. and Elsie's fair face, from which the colour had receded, now flamed into scarlet again, as she caught the flash in Mr. Remington's eyes, and the look of surprise, not unmingled with satisfaction, upon his wife's face. The only perfectly composed person in the room was little John. With distinctness and gravity he reiterated his command, "Kiss Ottissey first." Everyone present save Mr. Chilton knew perfectly who Ottissey was, and the flash of intelligence upon Mr. Remington's face, as well as the look upon Earl Mason's, told the keen-eyed old man just what the command meant. "She will not let me, little John," said Earl Mason, in utmost gravity. "I would be very glad to do so, but she will not allow it." "Yes," said little John in positive tones, "she will. Won't you, Ottissey? It is naughty not to let people kiss you when they want to very bad. Isn't it, this grandpa?" And he patted with condescending touch the trembling hand which supported him. Mr. Chilton had not been a courtly, self-possessed society gentleman for more than 40 years, for nothing. This was an eventful evening to him. Tremendous interests had been at stake, tremendous decisions had been made, some already expressed upon his knees, and some that he had meant to express very soon. He had not expected to be quite so prompt, nor to have so large an audience, yet he was quick-witted. Here was little John's appeal, here was his opportunity. He rose to the occasion. "She is my little girl," he said, "my boy," and his voice had a world of tenderness in it. "And she is a good little girl. She tries always to do as her father says." Little John was equal to the situation. "And will you tell her to let my Mr. Mason kiss her first?" he asked, with the slow dignity of a sovereign waiting for the decision of a subject. "Yes," said Mr. Chilton, "I will." And reaching for Elsie's hand, he placed it within that of Earl Mason. And Earl Mason, entirely willing to obey, bent his head and kissed Ottissey First, while His Royal Highness drew a sigh of satisfaction at the loyalty of all his subjects. End of chapter 29, and end of John Remington, Martyr, by Pansy and Mrs. C. M. Livingston.